19th century. Technological advances, the rapid development of civilization, the incredible economic growth. The dark, frightening Middle Ages are behind us. Ahead are steam engines, trains, electricity, and all the other prizes of modern life. However, this is only one side of that century. There is another. Dirt, poverty, hunger. Dark industrial premises were full of dust and dampness, terrible working and living conditions. And diseases. Cholera, smallpox, typhus, syphilis, they easily killed thousands of people. Some of them are in the past, and some are hiding and just waiting in the wings. But there is one of them which knocked on our door from the depths of centuries and firmly settled in our lives. It destroyed up to 25% of the entire European population in the 19th century and about 100 million people in the 20th. Nowadays, according to WHO statistics, about 10 million people are infected annually and about 2 million die every year. Its name is tuberculosis. It is among the 10 leading causes of death worldwide. Every third person carries its mycobacteria. Having caught this disease once, the victim can carry it for decades without suspecting anything. And only when the immune system is weak, it manifests itself. Yet, after the discovery of antibiotics, for some time it was considered defeated. However, the specificity of the disease and the growing resistance to drugs from year to year have jeopardized the WHO's goal of eliminating this disease once and for all. Considering that in the advanced stage, it can take up to 2 years to treat the disease, the emergence of resistant strains threatens us with serious troubles. Tuberculosis has been around for as long as we can remember. The species of bacteria Mycobacterium tuberculosis stood out about 3 million years ago, when very distant human ancestors ran across the savannas, hardly knowing that there was anything less than ants in the world. Tuberculosis bacillus acquired its modern form about 20,000 years ago, and already in the 5th century BC, this disease was successfully described by Hippocrates as a fatal lung disease, affecting primarily the weakened and the young. In the 2nd century AD, the Greek physician Cyrannus of Ephesus quite accurately described the signs of the disease. There is a latent fever which generally begins towards the end of the day and is relieved with the coming of the new day. This is accompanied by much coughing at the beginning and the end of the night, with the discharge of mucus and sputum. A hissing and whistling sound is heard in the chest. Red cheeks, loss of appetite, feeling of heaviness in the chest, stabbing pains, swollen feet. He even developed diagnostic methods that were many centuries ahead of their time. The ancient origin of tuberculosis is also evidenced by the fact that the remains of ancient mummies found in Egypt were often found with various kinds of physiological deformities. As a rule, they looked like overgrowths on the bones and were expressed in the abnormal development of the bone skeleton in the areas affected by tuberculosis. Such signs helped scientists establish the diagnosis almost unmistakably. And yes, tuberculosis can be not only pulmonary, but also bone and skin. Basically, it could be anything, depending on where the mycobacteria can get in. The main thing is that at least some fraction of oxygen is delivered there. Without it, mycobacteria do not survive very well, so they choose the lungs in most cases. In general, it is customary to separate exactly 2 historical periods of this disease. Before the discovery of its infectious origin, which took place in 1882, and, accordingly, after. Both of these periods are interesting in their own way, and we will analyze them in chronological order. Let's start with antiquity, of course. Extreme exhaustion is one of the inevitable symptoms of tuberculosis, and this sheer exhaustion is directly related to its name. In antiquity, it was described with the word phthisis, that is, withering, dehydration. But this trait is not the only one. It is manifested through a range of nonspecific symptoms, such as cough, slight prolonged fever, night sweats, and much more. These symptoms are also characteristic of many other diseases, which is why tuberculosis is often confused with bronchitis, influenza, pneumonia, and others. This resulted in the fact that in those days, many of those suffering from influenza or bronchitis often feared that their disease was tuberculosis. Although given the spread of tuberculosis, in those days it was possible. Weakened immunity could easily open the door to insidious mycobacteria. However, then, the views on all this were a bit different. Despite the fact that as early as the 18th century, the infectious route of transmission of tuberculosis was proven, physicians had their own thoughts on the subject. At that time, one overriding paradigm was used to explain the disease. That is, all diseases were associated exclusively with the type of person's personality. The humoral theory helped a lot in this. Hippocrates explained it as follows. According to this theory, all life on earth consisted of 4 elements: earth, water, fire, and air, and everything else in this world is just a different combination of these elements. And since Hippocrates was a physician, he said that these substances take the form of a liquid in the human body. So he supplemented this theory with 4 juices of which, in fact, all people consist. This is blood, yellow and black bile, and mucus, that is phlegm. Galen, the personal physician of Emperor Marcus Aurelius, helped link all this to the origins of the disease. Based on this theory, he suggested 4 types of personality, and we all know them: sanguine, choleric, melancholic, and phlegmatic. The idea was to endow each temperament with its own, specific to that species, fluid imbalance. For example, phlegmatic disposition was explained by the increased content of mucus. Sanguine people had an excess of blood, and so on. Accordingly, these 4 types of temperament were characterized by their own types of diseases. It was believed that choleric people were more likely to be prone to acute inflammation, exhaustion, or even hyperthyroidism. Phlegmatic people more often suffered from lung diseases, all sorts of bronchitis and influenza, and diabetes. Those were the days. It was customary to keep one's body toned down by a normal diet, a sleep schedule, the absence of overexertion and stress, and walks in the fresh air. These methods were quite reasonable. In general, the immune system works like this. It is stronger with such a lifestyle. The only difference was that back then, it was not called immunity, but the balance of vital juices. However, such a train of thought sometimes led people into very stupid situations. For example, it was believed that tuberculosis, anemia, and nervous fever, there is no such diagnosis now, can be provoked by eating heavy, salty, or too spicy food. People believed that alcohol, coffee, or a sedentary lifestyle, or even profound mental exercises could influence this. That is why this disease is often romanticized. Anger, unhappy love, sadness, or grief were also considered its reasons. Women from high society, refined, fragile creatures, who tended to think big and suffer in their chambers alone, were considered more prone to tuberculosis. Because of this, tuberculosis was even glorified, and in the 19th century it was given the aura of a noble disease that only the elite can get sick with. Many of the poets and writers of that time dreamed of dying from it. Many have succeeded. The disease was so widespread in those days that both the poor and the cream of the creams died from it equally. In the middle of the 19th century, tuberculosis deprived Britain of 3 Bronte sisters, famous English writers, at once. George Romanoff, brother of Nicholas II, died of tuberculosis. For a long time, the disease was not considered contagious. A bloody handkerchief was considered more a symbol of individual suffering than a sign that the patient had an open form of tuberculosis and was dangerous to others. There were also opinions that tuberculosis is inherited from father to child. Such children were described as angels. A touch of romanticism and fashion for tuberculosis made themselves felt in all spheres of the creative life of people. Composers, poets, and artists sacralized this disease. But there were people who did not treat it so reverently, but even with some disgust instead. The cause of tuberculosis was thought to be nocturnal emissions, heavy menstruation, and a strong addiction to masturbation. Thus, William Buchan, one of the most famous therapists of the 18th century, wrote that it's all our debauchery in every sense. But in the 19th century, with the growth of urbanization and industrial progress, it became clear that it was not young, pampered aristocrats who fell ill with tuberculosis. Tuberculosis killed factory workers in huge numbers. Every 10th city dweller died from pulmonary tuberculosis. Moreover, it was mainly men who fell ill, as they were the main working mass of factories and plants. There were many ways to treat tuberculosis, and few at the same time. Since ancient times, people have been advised to travel by sea, walk more often, and drink plenty of milk. Similar methods were popular in the late 19th century. Sea resorts, mountain sanatoriums, all kinds of medicinal salts have also become very popular. There were also more radical methods, but here, as they say, if nothing helps, then anything will do. They tried to treat cough with bloodletting or various herbs and potions. They tried to correct the imbalance of internal juices with cinchona bark and other astringents. Insomnia was relieved with tinctures of hemlock, belladonna, and opium. In extremely neglected cases, they acted more radically, prescribing mercury and lead sugar, although in this case the patient died before he could feel that his body was poisoned. Many followed the principle that the more painful the treatment, the more effective it was. But in general, it wasn't all so sad. Less painful methods were also a huge success. Some of them even helped, because tuberculosis was considered a disease that appears only due to an imbalance of vital juices. So doctors advised to lead a regular lifestyle and follow a diet which, by the way, was quite adequate. It prescribed to give up alcohol and any food with a pronounced taste and smell, and to increase the amount of milk consumed. The main prerequisite was clean air, preferably sea or mountain air. Tuberculosis sanatoriums, by the way, were very often built there, that is, in the mountains or on the seashore. It was also desirable to have beautiful, peaceful scenery, since tranquility was also one of the key conditions. By the way, Swiss tourism began with the treatment of tuberculosis patients, and after that, it became the concept of tourism familiar to us today. An atmosphere of exceptional tranquility was maintained in the sanatoriums. In some cases, it was even too much, forcing people to lie still in the fresh air for days on end and forbidding any activity, even reading or talking. It was quite boring and tiring. Many people recalled with horror the agonizing days they spent in tuberculosis sanatoriums, and they are quite understandable. Personally, I would have gone crazy from such treatment. If we look at tuberculosis from the point of view of microbiology, we will see that the so-called Bacillus kochii is a Mycobacterium tuberculosis. To date, we know about 74 of its species. They live everywhere, in air, in water, in soil, and accordingly in living organisms, such as animals or people. The prefix myco in their name means wax in Latin. It's for good reason. The fact is that there are long, waxy molecules of mycolic acid on the cell wall of this bacterium. Together with other substances that are unique to mycobacteria, they make up a strong shell that protects the bacterium from alkali, alcohol, various acids, and much more. Once in the body, these bacteria begin to develop, but very slowly, and in the process of life do not emit toxins, do not cause almost any reaction. Therefore, the immune system has almost zero response to the pathogen. However, when this does happen, another very tricky situation happens. Our bodies are always protected by immune cells. There are quite a few of those, and one is macrophage. Its task is to destroy the enemies that invaded the body, in this case, mycobacteria. As a rule, it happens like this. Macrophage notices the enemy, quickly catches and envelops it, placing it inside itself. We can say that it swallows and destroys it. This happens if bacteria have a low pathogenicity, but with those that have higher pathogenicity, things are much more complicated. Pathogenicity is the strength of the enemy, its ability to cause damage to the human body. Mycobacteria, getting into this bag called a macrophage, can produce special proteins that prevent them from being destroyed. And the more such bacteria a macrophage swallows, the higher the likelihood that it will not survive and fall apart. By the way, when this happens, it's a holiday for bacteria. First, they don't die. Second, the macrophage decay provides them with a good nutrient medium, so they can develop in large numbers there, creating large lesions of disease over time. This is what they call primary tuberculosis. In this scenario, foci of decaying tissue, inflammation, and cavities are observed in the lungs, like craters on the moon. At the initial stage, the symptoms are either not expressed at all, or they look like mild bronchitis. With the formation of cavities, they're also called caverns, things get much worse. Such tuberculosis turns into its active form with all the symbols inherent in it: a bloody handkerchief, aristocratic pallor, and unnatural thinness. However, there's also a third scenario, when the immune system and the bacterium are in some balance. Then the macrophage, which cannot cope with mycobacteria on its own, calls on numerous other immune cells for help. They all combine into a granuloma, something like a protective bag, enveloping the focus and closing it forever. Those granulomas can be either small, consisting of only 3 or 4 cell nuclei, or giant, representing a large accumulation of cells reaching several millimeters in diameter. You can say this is a bit out of line with our understanding of the giant, but believe me, in a microscopic world, this is a hell of a size. Thus, microbacteria inside such dense capsules can stay in the human body for life. Besides, it's almost impossible to remove such small foci from the body. Therefore, we all, to some extent, can experience tuberculosis that has come from nowhere when we get older, although we were infected with it in our distant youth. At autopsy, granulomas are found in 97% of people. Tuberculosis is a very dangerous and extensive disease. The risk that a person will contract it in their lifetime is about 15%. Most often, it is a pulmonary form of the disease, but tuberculosis can affect absolutely any part of the body, from bones to skin. Skin tuberculosis was more commonly contracted in rural areas through contact with contaminated milk. Yes, cows also get tuberculosis. Cats and dogs, too. It's good that people came up with the sterilization of milk. In the past, this problem was very acute. As I said earlier, the whole history of the study of tuberculosis is divided into 2 periods: before March 24, 1882, and after. I have already told you about what happened before, but what happened on that day and further on, we have yet to find out. So, March 24, 1882 is a memorable date in the history of medical science. This day literally changed the further development of medicine. Robert Koch, the outstanding German scientist who discovered anthrax and the person who was to discover the causative agent of Asiatic cholera, set himself the goal of discovering the sinister microbe responsible for 25% of all deaths in Europe. If he managed to find the causative agent of anthrax quite easily, because the dead animals were just stuffed with these bacilli, things were much more complicated with tuberculosis. Many other researchers have tried in vain to trace the signs of this infection in the lungs of people who died from tuberculosis. Besides, little was known about tuberculosis at all. Many did not believe at all that it could be caused by any pathogen. However, supporters of this theory already knew that tuberculosis is an infectious disease by that time. This was first hypothesized by the English physician Benjamin Martin back in 1720. And already in the 19th century, the incomparable Julius Friedrich Cohnheim conducted an experiment on transplanting infected lung tissue into the anterior chamber of the rabbit's eye and spoke about it in detail. And studying the description of the development of the disease inside the eyes of rabbits, the appearance of small bumps, which would later be called tubercles, Koch realized that apart from them, nothing could be found. Where were those ill-fated bacilli that caused tuberculosis? There was no equipment to see them back then. Koch tried all the existing lenses and found nothing. Then it occurred to him to try dyeing the infected tissue for the microbe to manifest itself. Koch undertook to test absolutely all types of dyes known to him. He crumbled the material and painted it. Nothing worked. But one day, Koch dyed the material blue and, looking through a microscope, noticed that the destroyed lung cells were completely dotted with small clusters of thin blue-stained bacilli. "How lovely," he muttered. "They're not straight but seem to be slightly curved. And here's a whole pack of them, just like a pack of cigarettes. And what's that? The devil sits inside the lung tissue. I just can't believe it. Has this tuberculosis killer finally been caught?" Koch was inspired and continued to stain other tissues of the deceased. And wherever he took the material, he stumbled upon these thin, curved bacilli everywhere, not similar to any bacterium known to him. At this time, rabbits and guinea pigs began to fall ill one after another. They lost interest in food and huddled in a corner. Their temperature rose, and they all died suddenly. Koch continued his experiments. He cut out the tubercles and immediately painted them with blue paint, and every time he found those very thin bacilli. Koch dyed an incredible amount of material from dead animals and people, and always found them. But there were none of them in the material of those who died not from tuberculosis. This meant that Koch managed to identify the causative agent of tuberculosis, but the risk of error still remained. To be absolutely sure of the discovery, he had to isolate the microbe in its purest form. To do this, it was necessary to grow it in a test tube without impurities. To Koch's surprise, the bacteria stubbornly refused to grow in any nutrient solution, even the one he had come up with the day before, with the addition of gelatine. The scientist was perplexed. Many other bacteria had less than what he tried, and these would grow in no circumstances. And one day, annoyed by yet another failure, Koch glanced at the used test tubes and suddenly experienced something like insight. He needed a different media, a kind of imitation of a living organism. He needed clotted blood serum. So Koch went to the farm and took blood at the slaughterhouse. However, the blood coagulated to a gel-like state alone was not enough for the serum to work. It was also necessary to imitate life in this media, that is, to heat it up to the temperature of at least a guinea pig. Having completed all the manipulations, Koch dissected a guinea pig that had recently died of tuberculosis, carefully removed the bacteria from it, immersed them in containers with prepared serum, and placed them in a thermostat, setting the required temperature. A day passed, another day, a third, and there was no result. Koch was already disappointed. Indeed, with such ideal conditions, other bacteria grew like mushrooms after rain, and these still don't work. Yet he kept waiting and did not wind down the experiment. His patience paid off on the 15th day. On the surface of the solution, Koch found barely noticeable shiny spots. Without losing any time, he removed the material, placed it under a microscope, and finally saw the picture that presented itself to him every time he examined the tissues of people who died of tuberculosis. However, the bacteria this time were small. They were just beginning their life's journey. But that made them no less dangerous. Now all that remained was to introduce this pure culture to healthy guinea pigs. If they became ill with tuberculosis after that, there will be no doubt that these bacteria are the causative agent of tuberculosis. Among the experimental animals were all the traditional inhabitants of laboratories of that time: mice, rats, rabbits, and guinea pigs. Also, less familiar animals joined their ranks: turtles, snakes, and even fish. If the warm-blooded were infected with the ill-fated bacilli, then the representatives of the cold-blooded did not notice the disease at all. Then he came up with the idea to check the very method of infecting. This was necessary for the sake of completeness. Healthy people certainly become infected with these bacilli by breathing them in with the sprayed sputum of people with tuberculosis. It was necessary to check whether it was possible to artificially infect healthy animals in this way, he reasoned. The animals should be sprayed with bacilli. Then Koch made a huge insulated chamber with tubes entering it, through which he had to send a suspension consisting of an air mass with bacilli. He equipped it in the garden under the laboratory window and planted mice, rabbits, and guinea pigs there. He pumped this poisoned air there for several days, for a half an hour every day. After 10 days, the 3 rabbits were suffocating from lack of air because their lungs were full of tuberculosis bacteria. On the 20th day, the guinea pigs began to wither one by one. No matter how sad and scary it may sound, their suffering helped save millions of human lives. And on March 24, 1882, a meeting of the Physiological Society summed up this entire work of Robert Koch. All the most prominent German medical authorities were present there. The news that Koch had discovered the tuberculosis bacillus spread all over the world, from Chicago to Constantinople and Tokyo. There were headlines about Bacillus kochii, as it was named after the scientist, in every newspaper. This, however, was not surprising, since a microbe was discovered that was killing millions of people all over the world. This undoubtedly was the first step towards understanding the disease, and therefore towards its speedy eradication. Although literally immediately after this discovery, described in colors and set forth in Koch's famous postulates, the author himself went to Egypt to curb the cholera bacillus, for which he later received an award from the German government of 100,000 German marks. But Koch was wrong about one thing. He believed that tuberculosis cannot be transmitted from animal to person, and that milk and meat of infected animals were absolutely safe. Later, he managed to isolate tuberculin, a substance that Bacillus kochii produced in the course of their life. He thought that this substance would help in the treatment of tuberculosis and, without proper verification, hastened to announce that a cure for tuberculosis had been found. How wrong he was. It has been found that tuberculin, if taken as a medicine, is very allergenic and does not protect against tuberculosis. Complaints and accusations poured in. People began to die, and this, of course, cooled Koch after the fame that quickly fell upon him. Later, in 1905, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for his discoveries in the treatment of tuberculosis. As early as in 1907, the Austrian pediatrician Clemens von Pirquet demonstrated the so-called tuberculin test. A small scratch was made on the forearm, and tuberculin was rubbed into it. The reaction of the skin was used to conclude whether the person had tuberculosis or not. A little later, it was replaced by the method proposed by Charles Manteau. It was he who suggested administering tuberculin under the skin. This gave a more accurate result. For several years, the procedure has been improved and has come down to our times as the well-known Manteau test. The bottom line is to check if a person has specific immune cells that respond with inflammation to the introduction of tuberculin. If a person has ever been in contact with tuberculosis bacilli, the body will begin to produce T lymphocytes, which are responsible for the recognition and timely destruction of mycobacteria. And if a real Bacilli kochii has been in the body, there will be a lot of T lymphocytes, and the area of inflammation at the injection site will be larger. If this is the case, a person will be sent for additional examinations. Although the Manteau test has many advantages, it also has its drawbacks. First, you have to wait 3 days. Second, it can give a false result, for example, after a recent cold. The thing is that the immune system after an illness is in an excited state and can fail. And third, it can give a false result in those who were vaccinated against tuberculosis in childhood. Now the Manteau test has practically been replaced by tests that are very similar in principle. For example, IGRA tests and others. In general, there was a real boom in discoveries related to tuberculosis at the beginning of the 20th century. Following the invention of the Manteau test, a new method for growing Bacillus kochii was developed. Completely weakened strain. It was bred by repeated fed batch process. This bacillus formed the basis of the tuberculosis vaccine Bacillus calmette-guerin, BCG, By the way, the only live vaccine at the moment and the oldest of all existing ones. The BCG is still under discussion. In the United States, the vaccine is almost not inoculated because this disease is considered almost defeated and occurs rather as an exception. Speaking of the U.S. and another diagnostic method that managed to eradicate, if not the disease itself, then the method of its unimpeded person-to-person transmission, X-rays came to the aid of American physicians. Back in 1895, the German physicist Wilhelm Conrad Röntgen invented a method for partially darkening a photographic plate using gamma radiation by sheer chance. This invention made it possible to shine through objects and display the areas that were not visible through on the film. As you can see, this method was immediately adopted in medicine. First, by the surgeons who prayed to God for a miraculous way to view the bones without unnecessary openings, and then everyone else. Just 2 years later, Boston physician Francis William discovered that lung infection could be seen with the help of those mysterious rays. The affected areas are displayed as some kind of gaps in the picture. Doctors call them darkening. At that time, this was the best way of early stages tuberculosis manifestation. In the picture, one could literally see everything in detail, but there was one catch. This method was very expensive. Like all new inventions, it cost fantastic money, so it was difficult to carry out extensive preventive checks. Another plus of X-ray is that with its help, tuberculosis could be established at an early stage when there are still no external manifestations of the disease and tuberculosis has not yet developed into an active form when it becomes deadly to others. Although ideas about universal prevention were quite humane, it was next to impossible to convince people to take X-rays. An important aspect was the financial component, because it was necessary to check everyone massively and annually. For such innovations, local authorities, as a rule, always had one answer: there's no money. A telling case of such monetary indifference happened in the 1930s in Detroit. The powerful industrial city had many factories and plants, which in turn provided jobs for people who had to work in damp and muddy conditions. And this, as we already know, increases the risk of infection, as well as the very fact of crowding people in one place. On the streets, the situation with tuberculosis was just a nightmare, especially in working neighborhoods. Day by day, the situation became worse and worse. A small group of enthusiasts from the local athletic club decided to remedy the situation by pressing the case on the local city government, but not with the help of arguments about morality and philanthropy. These kinds of things hardly touched anyone. They decided to make things better with simple numbers, and they chose the right time, the height of the Great Depression. They calculated how much money and time the city would need to cure one seriously ill person and one in a mild case. And I must say, even they themselves were surprised by the result. It turned out that for the treatment of a patient in a mild form, 9 months of hospitalization are needed, and for the treatment of a patient with a severe form, as much as 18 months. Then they calculated the cost of X-rays for diagnosis, and they got quite impressive sums for those times. Then Henry Vaughn, head of the Detroit Health Department, along with other doctors, wrote down the whole situation on paper, and by a happy coincidence, William James, editor of the local newspaper, the Detroit News, read it. His eloquence and ability to present information clearly helped convince magnates and some officials in the city government to take action. This was done purely for reasons of the economy. But there was one more major issue. It was necessary to convince absolutely all the inhabitants of the city that they had to come to the hospital for a check. It didn't matter if the person felt sick or not. Everyone had to show up. Then the enthusiasts, having funds for this whole undertaking, got together and developed a joint plan of action. And you know, after so many years, we can say that it was like one small local information war. In November 1934, the Detroit News began to assure the citizens of Detroit that they were murderers on the front page. The headlines were that science could finally eradicate tuberculosis in the shortest possible time, But the city's residents did not want this themselves, and that was why, with their tacit agreement, they were nothing but accomplices of this murderer. That it was precisely on their account that all these thousands of Detroiters die every year from tuberculosis. Day after day, the information space of Detroit was bombarded with more and more evidence of the insidious cooperation of the townspeople with this cruel killer, tuberculosis. Residents were informed that a person with an active form of tuberculosis who did not pass the mandatory free preventive diagnostics walking around the city presents a great danger. It was even said that such a person is more dangerous than a bandit armed with a machine gun. Then they gave horrifying examples of how people, out of ignorance, refuse to be examined and, without paying attention to their condition, infect their relatives and friends, actually killing them. Severe criticism also fell upon physicians who, due to their ignorance, treated people for a very long time from ordinary bronchitis instead of tuberculosis. And when the people of Detroit got tired of the constant propaganda in the newspapers, they turned on the radio. But they heard something there that plunged them into horror. A hollow, barking cough was broadcast thrice a day on the Detroit news station, for no special reason, without any warning. And the cough was always followed by a gloomy voice, "Cough of death." Then there was a wild screeching and giggling, and later the ominous chorus of 3 witches sounded.
"I am indifference. I forgot about the cough of death. It's dangerous, I know, but let it kill thousands of people every year. I am a mystery. I have heard of the cough of death, but I find it superfluous to speak of such terrible things. I avoid talking about it. I am ignorance. I don't know much about the cough of death, so I don't do anything to fight it."
And that's how it was every day for several weeks. Even in the newspapers and on the radio, they said that if you turn to a doctor at an early stage, problems can be avoided and cured. I don't even know if such methods would work now. However, at that time, especially in the families of workers, the problem with tuberculosis was very acute, and it was scary. Everyone knew what tuberculosis was and how people died from it. Surprisingly, it was precisely this tactic that allowed the United States, one of the first countries, to almost completely eradicate tuberculosis on its territory. And it is for this reason that the BCG vaccine is not made in the United States, because now for every 100,000 people, 2 to 3 people become infected with tuberculosis, unlike in less developed countries where tuberculosis claims many lives. A breakthrough in the fight against tuberculosis came in the summer of 1943. This is the time when the American microbiologist Zellman Waxman discovered streptomycin, for which he received the Nobel Prize. In 1932, the American National Tuberculosis Association approached him for help. Even then, it was known that mycobacteria do not live long in the soil, but no one knew why it was like that. The antibiotics subject was in the air, and many researchers came across something similar, but there were no strong results. So Waxman sprang into action. For a long period of time, he studied soil microbes, observing the microorganisms fight in their struggle for life. He began testing absolutely every strain of bacteria in the soil. He had to go through around tens of thousands of different strains before he could even get anything. In 1940, he caught a break. Based on one of the strains, he derived a substance called actinomycin. This substance perfectly coped with all types of mycobacteria. But there was one downside. It has always killed experimental animals. That time, it was all the same much-suffering guinea pigs. In 1942, a new substance called streptothricin was discovered. But the problem was that its therapeutic window was very narrow. That is, the therapeutic and the lethal dose did not differ much. The experiments continued, and soon his assistant, Albert Schatz, managed to find the coveted substance that killed all mycobacteria, but kept guinea pigs alive. A new antibiotic had been discovered. It was an epoch-making discovery. And by the way, Zellman Waxman is the man who coined the term antibiotics. Alexander Fleming, who discovered penicillin earlier, called it an antibiotic post factum. For the first few years, streptomycin was extremely active, but after about 10 years, its activity began to gradually decline. Now its effect on microbes is quite small. But this discovery undoubtedly became a new milestone in the struggle of mankind with tuberculosis. The joy, of course, was not complete, because the long-term use of the drug in humans still made itself felt. Severe side effects often developed. In some cases, people even lost their hearing. Closer to the 1980s, new strains of mycobacteria began to appear that were completely resistant to streptomycin and other antibiotics that were discovered shortly after Waxman's discovery. And then it became clear that the use of one type of antibiotic for the treatment of tuberculosis is fraught with the rapid emergence of resistance. As a result, only one antibiotic is currently used to treat latent tuberculosis. In the case of active forms, complex therapy is prescribed, consisting of several types of antibiotics, the so-called first line. However, mycobacteria can adapt to such an attack, and then second-line drugs may be required, but they are taken in case of emergency due to very serious side effects. Well, if this cannot help, then alas, no one can now give an answer to the question of what to do. Scientists around the world are still trying to find new ways to treat tuberculosis. The emergence of resistant strains and the spread of HIV infection complicate this task. Today, up to 40% of all mycobacteria found in the population that cause tuberculosis in humans are resistant to antibiotics. Particularly affected are those countries in which the percentage of HIV-infected population is high. For example, in Africa, the majority of all HIV-infected people die from tuberculosis. Tuberculosis, together with HIV, work like an infernal mixture, mutually accelerating each other's development. Tuberculosis is very cunning and extremely dodgy. The disease develops slowly for a long time, killing its carrier. The World Health Organization has developed effective programs to combat tuberculosis. The development of new technologies gives us hope that we will still be able to defeat it completely. Health to all of us. Sincerely yours, Dr. PopMed.